In a bar in Mauritius, Sarah and Jackson are spending time together. Sarah is preparing to leave for London to start a new job, but Jackson wishes she would stay. They watch videos of their time on the island, and Jackson offers to take her to the airport. Sarah refuses, saying she doesn't want a goodbye. He suggests one last drink, and she agrees. While Jackson is in the bathroom, Sarah finishes her drink and, conflicted, decides to leave. She places money on the table and walks out. When Jackson returns, he finds her gone and feels disappointed. A year has passed, and Sarah is now living and working in London. During a phone call with her best friend, Pascal, they discuss Pascal's upcoming wedding, where Sarah is set to be the maid of honor. Pascal asks Sarah to take care of an errand, and she agrees. Upon arriving in Mauritius, Sarah heads to the countryside to pick up liquor for the wedding from her friend Solomon. When Solomon brings up Jackson, asking if she remembers him, Sarah feigns ignorance, pretending not to know who he's referring to. She thanks him and leaves. Later, Pascal and Sarah are at a waterfall. Pascal insists they jump together, and they do. Afterward, they head to a bar for a drink. While they're chatting, Sarah notices people disembarking from a boat and spots Jackson among them. She's struck by how good he looks. Pascal mentions that Jackson now runs a diving school and that he'll be at the beach party later that night. At the beach party, Sarah spots Jackson among his friends and a woman she noticed earlier. While talking with Pascal, she tries to gather the courage to approach him. Eventually, she walks over, and they exchange somewhat awkward small talk before Jackson excuses himself, mentioning some work he needs to take care of. Sarah decides to follow him and offers to walk him home. Though hesitant, he agrees. They end up in his garage, where they share drinks, and Sarah compliments him on how well his business is doing. Jackson credits her for inspiring him. As she explores the space, she tries on a life jacket, and Jackson inflates it, leading to Sarah playfully getting upset and hitting him with it. He lifts her up and they share a brief, tender moment. Jackson then asks what she really wants. Sarah admits that she missed him, but Jackson questions the point if she's just going to leave again. Sarah argues that he could have come with her to London, pointing out that sacrifices work both ways. Frustrated, she asks him not to make things awkward at the wedding tomorrow. They have a brief argument before kissing and ultimately spending the night together. The next morning, Sarah quietly slips out without waking Jackson. Pascal calls her, mentioning they've been waiting for 30 minutes and can't delay any longer since the ferry to the wedding island is about to leave, and it's the only one available. In a rush, Sarah contacts Freddie, a pilot, to ask if she can hitch a ride to the wedding. Freddie teases her for not being dressed appropriately for the occasion and reminds her that she's not the only passenger, so there's no need to feel privileged. She then turned to see Jackson, who was upset because she left again without any notice. While they're flying, Freddie asks Sarah to sit in the co-pilot seat, wanting to discuss her dating life. She admits she's dating, but there's no one significant. Freddie then offers her a chance to fly the plane, showing her how to keep it steady. As he instructs her, he takes his medication and tells her she'll need to take control once he turns off the autopilot. She manages to turn the autopilot back on, but suddenly, Freddie starts coughing. Panicked, Sarah shouts to Jackson that Freddie is having a heart attack and needs water immediately, but Jackson can't find any. Freddie then loses consciousness and collapses onto the yoke, causing the plane to dive sharply. In the chaos, an oxygen tank, which had been misplaced, strikes Jackson on the head before hitting the windshield and damaging the electronics. Despite the chaos, Jackson regains his composure and manages to move Freddie off the yoke. However, the plane continues to descend rapidly toward the ocean. With significant effort, Sarah pulls the yoke up and levels the plane. Once the plane is stable, Sarah urges Jackson to help Freddie. She asks him to perform CPR, but Jackson informs her that there's no pulse. Despite this, he tries CPR for several minutes before realizing that Freddie has passed away. Overcome with grief, Jackson removes his jacket and gently covers Freddie's body. Jackson takes the pilot's seat and asks Sarah if she can fly the plane. She admits she can't, having only had a few lessons with Freddie 2 years ago. They check the plane's condition and discover the GPS is broken. They think to use their phones, but they're dead. The radio offers no help either, and when Sarah tries the autopilot, it's also malfunctioning. With half a tank of fuel left, Jackson realizes they're in a dire situation. No pilot, no autopilot, and no clear way to land the plane. Fortunately, the compass still works. Sarah recalls they were flying west earlier and suggests turning back that way, but Jackson cautions that west now might not be the same as before. They decide to set a timer to determine when to turn the plane west again. Ahead, they spot a massive storm. Suddenly, someone comes through the radio. He asks for their identification, and Sarah explains who they are and that Freddie, their pilot, has died. He introduces himself as Samuel and inquires if she knows how to fly. Sarah explains she's been in the air with Freddie a few times but lacks proper training. Unfortunately, the signal cuts out, and they find themselves heading straight into the storm. Samuel reconnects briefly, advising that the storm is too large to avoid, and their only chance of landing is to fly west, directly into it. Once again, the signal is lost as Sarah guides the plane into the storm. Jackson tells Sarah that she should take the pilot's seat to better see the controls, so they switch places. As the storm worsens, Sarah refuses to fly directly into it, just as lightning strikes the plane. She climbs higher, trying to fly over the storm, but Jackson warns they're ascending too quickly. They reach clear skies above the storm and briefly feel relieved, but the relief is short-lived as altitude sickness sets in. Sarah begins to struggle with her vision, noticing that the dials seem seem to be moving erratically. Suddenly, she passes out, causing the plane to nosedive again. Jackson manages to wake her and she regains control of the plane, but they soon lose visibility as the storm engulfs them. After a tense struggle, they manage to level the plane again. However, they realize they're lost, with no clear idea of where they're heading. They attempt to use the compass, but it's now broken too. Without knowing which direction west is, they risk flying in circles. Jackson then remembers a way to fix a compass by magnetizing it and placing it in liquid. He improvises, and the compass begins pointing north again, allowing them to determine where west is. They eventually emerge from the storm but quickly realize the fuel is dangerously low. Sarah recalls the reserve tank and switches to it, watching the fuel gauge spike before it drops rapidly again. She initially thinks it's just adjusting, but the gauge remains low. Jackson suspects there's a leak in the fuel tanks, which are located on the wings. Determined to check, Jackson decides to go out on the wing, despite Sarah's protests about how dangerous it is. Despite her warnings, Jackson insists on going. Jackson ties a rope around his waist and opens the door, instructing Sarah to slow down the plane as he climbs out. With no other option, Sarah flies the plane while anxiously watching Jackson make his way to the front. He reaches the engine, where fuel sprays into his face as he opens it. Nearly slipping, Jackson holds on tightly and discovers a leak in the fuel line. After a failed attempt, he successfully patches the hole with duct tape on his second try. The fuel gauge steadies, indicating that his fix worked. As he tries to climb back, Jackson slips and ends up dangling under the wing. Sarah rushes to the door to help, but the plane swerves without anyone controlling the yoke. She quickly uses a seatbelt to secure the yoke and stabilize the plane. Jackson tells her to cut the rope, which she does, and then urges him to grab her hand. He manages to do so but slams into the side of the plane. With a strong pull, she manages to get him back inside, and they both collapse onto the floor, breathing sighs of relief. However, their relief turns to concern when they realize Jackson's arm is badly injured. Sarah is shocked by the severity of the injury and tells him not to look. She grabs a towel and one of the bottles of alcohol intended for the wedding. Jackson takes a swig before Sarah. Jackson grabs the alcohol to clean the wound, causing him intense pain. Trying to distract him, she talks about memories of their time together and then quickly snaps his arm back into place. She improvises a splint using a hanger, wrapping his arm with it and securing it with bandages. Sarah praises Jackson for his bravery, acknowledging how incredible it was that he managed to fix the plane while outside in such dangerous conditions. With the fuel gauge down to 5%, Sarah and Jackson decide to continue flying in hopes of finding land. Sarah suggests they lighten the plane to conserve fuel, and the plan works, helping the fuel gauge remain steady. Jackson then subtly hints that they should consider getting rid of Freddie's body to further reduce weight. Though it pains her, Sarah agrees it's necessary. Jackson reassures her that it is the right thing to do, even if it feels awful. Sarah then proposes getting rid of the alcohol, but Jackson suggests using it as fuel since it contains ethanol. Realizing this could work, Sarah decides to take on the risky task herself, given Jackson's injury. She climbs out onto the plane and holds onto the wing, reaching the fuel tank's valve. Jackson carefully hands her the bottles of alcohol, but the strong wind causes one to slip from her grasp. Despite the setback, she successfully pours in 3 bottles. As Jackson tries to pass her the final bottle, it slips from his hands and falls inside the plane. Jackson urges her to come back inside, and just as she nearly loses her grip, Sarah grabs onto the plane's bar and pulls herself back in, collapsing inside with a mix of relief and panic. Back inside, Jackson tells Sarah that the makeshift fuel solution is working, and he praises her for her bravery and quick thinking. Jackson spots what might be an island in the distance and suggests they turn back. Sarah agrees, and despite the agonizing pain from his injury, Jackson helps guide her as she wraps his arm tighter with a piece of clothing. They continue searching for land as the fuel gauge steadily drops. Eventually, the tank empties and the plane's engine shuts down. Facing what feels like their final moments, Sarah refuses to accept that this is the end. She apologizes to Jackson for leaving him 2 years ago, acknowledging that her departure led to their current situation. Jackson also expresses regret for not understanding her needs back then. They both admit to being selfish, and Sarah reveals that she hates goodbyes because they make her want to stay. Just then, Jackson spots the island he saw earlier. Overwhelmed with relief, they prepare for the landing. Jackson tries to guide Sarah through the process, but as they approach the water, the plane crashes and flips over, and they both lose consciousness as it begins to sink. The plane settles on the ocean floor at the edge of an underwater cliff. Sarah regains consciousness first and desperately tries to wake Jackson as the plane fills with water. Struggling, she finally manages to open the door, swims out, and surfaces. She then looked around but Jackson was nowhere to be found. She frantically called him out but he was not there. Realizing Jackson is still trapped, she dives back down. Jackson was not in the plane. She then finds him entangled in the wing. She swims to him and quickly secures a life jacket on him and inflates it just as the plane slips off the cliff's edge and disappears into the abyss. Sarah narrowly avoids being dragged down with it and brings Jackson to the surface. Reaching the island, she performs CPR, and Jackson regains consciousness. Relieved and exhausted, they lie on the sand, laughing at their survival. However, their relief is short-lived when Sarah wakes to find the tide rising. Jackson realizes they're on a sandbar that will soon be underwater. Sarah, overwhelmed, cries out in frustration as they face yet another life-threatening situation. They don't have any means of of survival now. Drifting in the open ocean, Sarah begins to despair, fearing they won't make it. She tearfully asks Jackson what they'll do, and as the reality of their situation sets in, Jackson told her that he was getting tired and confessed his love for her. Sarah reciprocates, and they share a kiss, bracing themselves for the worst. Just as hope seems lost, a boat appears on the horizon. They screamed at the boat, but the boat had already seen them and was coming towards them. Sarah waved her hands and then started swimming to it, pulling Jackson along. As she neared the boat, she told them to be careful with Jackson because he was hurt. Rescuers quickly pull them aboard, and Sarah laughs and cries simultaneously, unable to believe they've finally been saved. On the boat, Jackson told her no more goodbyes, and she confirmed. As the ordeal ends, they share a kiss, grateful to have survived together. With that, the movie ends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.